My son shook my hand at my own retirement dinner. Not a hug, a handshake, like I was someone he had just finished a business meeting with. By the time I understood what he was building, he was already 3 steps ahead, or so he thought. I remember looking at his face across the table. Proud, polished, already planning. His wife, Natalie, sat beside him, cutting her steak with the kind of precision that made everything feel like a transaction. She smiled at me once. Too wide, too quick. The kind of smile that arrives before the real conversation. That was 18 months before the court date, before the documents, before everything they thought they owned disappeared. But that night, at the dinner they organized, in the restaurant they chose, at the table they reserved, I was still just the old man with a generous heart and a name on a few buildings. Or so they believed. My name is Richard Harlan, 64 years old, widower, father, and for 31 years, the quiet owner of a commercial real estate portfolio that stretched across 4 cities. I did not build it loudly. My wife Eleanor always said I was allergic to attention. She was right. I built slowly, property by property, trust by trust, always through holding companies, always through patient structures my attorney, Gerald Marsh, had spent decades helping me protect. Eleanor died 4 years ago. Breast cancer. 17 months from diagnosis to the day I sat beside her hospital bed, holding her hand while she finally stopped fighting. After that, everything changed. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Grief does not arrive like a storm. It arrives like a slow leak. Quiet. Constant. Invisible until the damage is already done. My son Marcus noticed a change. He started calling more often, visiting more regularly, bringing Natalie, who laughed at everything I said and called me Dad with a warmth I wanted desperately to believe. Looking back, the signs were obvious. But when you are lonely, kindness feels like love, even when it is strategy. The first conversation happened 6 months after Eleanor's funeral. Marcus sat across from me in the living room, coffee between us, Natalie in the kitchen, making herself invisible in that careful way people do when they want you to forget they are listening. Marcus leaned forward. Dad, you shouldn't have to manage all of this alone. He meant the properties, the holding companies, the portfolios, the trusts. I'm managing fine, I said. He nodded slowly, like he was being patient with a child. I know you are, but Gerald is getting older. You're getting older. He paused. What happens if something happens to you? I looked at him. Then the structures Gerald built handle it. Marcus smiled, not warmly, carefully. Dad, Gerald set those up 20 years ago. Things have changed. We should modernize, consolidate, make it easier for everyone. Everyone. I remember that word sitting strangely in the room. At the time, I thought he meant family. Now I know he meant himself. The proposal came 3 weeks later. Printed. Bound. Professional. Marcus placed it on the dining table like a gift. Inside were recommendations to restructure 3 of my largest holding entities, consolidate ownership, simplify management, and add Marcus as co-director across all major assets. Natalie had apparently consulted with a financial firm. Marcus presented it like a kindness. We just want to make sure you're protected, Dad. I read every page twice. Then I looked at him. I'll have Gerald review it. Something crossed Marcus's face. Quick, almost invisible. But I saw it. Irritation. Not frustration with the process. Irritation that I had not simply agreed. Gerald's methodology is outdated, he said. Maybe, I replied, but he's mine. That evening, after Marcus and Natalie left, I sat at the kitchen table alone. The house was quiet. Eleanor's reading glasses were still on the windowsill. I had never moved them. I poured coffee I did not drink, and I thought about the word everyone, the way Marcus had said it, the way Natalie had smiled when he did. 2 people finishing each other's sentences. 2 people who had clearly practiced this conversation before they arrived. I sat there for a long time. Then I picked up the phone and called Gerald. I need you to look at something, I said. Come in the morning, he replied. He did not ask what it was. Gerald always knew when morning mattered. Gerald Marsh was 71 years old. He had handled my father's estate, my first property purchase, Eleanor's medical trusts, and every major financial structure I had built over 3 decades. He was careful, precise, and completely unimpressed by polished presentations from young men in good suits. When I handed him Marcus's proposal, he read it without expression. His office smelled like old paper and leather. The clock on his wall ticked steadily. When he finished, he set the document down. How much does your son know about your actual holdings? What I've told him, I said, which isn't everything. Gerald nodded slowly. Good. Then he looked at me over his glasses. Richard, this document, if signed, would give Marcus legal authority to act on your behalf across every consolidated entity. I already suspected that, and the consolidation itself would dissolve the protective separations we spent 15 years building. He tapped the summary page. Whoever drafted this either doesn't understand what they're dismantling. He paused, or understands it perfectly. That sentence stayed with me for weeks. I did not confront Marcus. Gerald advised patience. Let them show you more, he said. Pressure reveals intention. So I waited and watched. Marcus began stopping by unannounced, asking questions about specific properties, which tenants were long-term, which buildings were under-leveraged, which holding companies had the cleanest structures. He framed it as curiosity, as interest, as a son wanting to understand his father's legacy. Natalie was more dangerous, because she was softer about it. She would bring food I had not asked for, sit beside me on the couch, ask about Eleanor, about my health, about whether I was sleeping well. It felt like care. Looking back, it was inventory. She was cataloging my vulnerabilities, finding the soft places. One afternoon, she sat across from me with tea in her hands and said, "You know, Marcus worries about you, more than he shows." I looked at her. Does he? She nodded, her eyes soft. He just doesn't want you to be alone with all of this. She gestured vaguely, at the house, at the walls, at the life Eleanor and I had built together. All of this, she said, like it was a burden, like she was offering to lift it. I smiled gently. That's kind. She smiled back, warm, practiced. That was the afternoon I understood Natalie completely. She was not helping Marcus. Marcus was helping her. One evening, I walked past the study and heard her on the phone. Her voice was low. He's being slower than we expected. Pause. I know, but once the consolidation goes through, the rest is straightforward. Pause. Then she laughed softly. He trusts Marcus. That's all we need. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, then walked back to the living room, sat down, picked up my book, and turned to a page I had already read. That was the night Patience stopped being passive. Gerald and I met twice that week. I told him everything. The phone call, the afternoon with tea, the word everyone. He listened without surprise. People who plan carefully always underestimate the people they're planning against, he said. Then he asked me a question I had not expected. How much do you want them to have? I looked at him. Nothing they didn't earn. He nodded once. Then we have work to do. The restructuring we built was not revenge yet. It was protection. Gerald created a new layer trust system, the Harlan Family Preservation Trust. On paper, it appeared to simplify ownership. In reality, it added 3 additional legal barriers between Marcus and any asset he might try to claim. It also quietly transferred controlling interest in 2 key properties to a charitable foundation Eleanor had always wanted to establish. The Eleanor Harlan Foundation for Family Housing. Real, functional, and legally completely separate from anything Marcus could touch. Gerald explained it calmly. If Marcus pursues legal guardianship or capacity challenges, which I believe he is building toward, the trust structures make it nearly impossible to consolidate control. I asked. And if he challenges the foundation? He would be challenging a charitable entity established in his mother's name. Gerald looked at me steadily. Let him try. 3 months later, Marcus made his move. Not a confrontation. An application. He filed for a limited conservatorship. The legal argument that I was showing signs of cognitive decline following Eleanor's death, and that my advanced age made independent financial management a risk. He had statements. A neighbor who mentioned I had seemed confused on one occasion. A distant cousin who said I had repeated myself during a phone call. Small things. Individually meaningless. Together, shaped into a narrative. The narrative of a grieving old man who needed to be protected from himself by his devoted son and his concerned daughter-in-law. I remember Gerald calling me the morning the filing arrived. His voice was steady. It's happened. I looked out the kitchen window at Eleanor's garden. The roses she planted still bloomed every May. How bad? I asked. Manageable, he said, but only because we prepared. The conservatorship hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in March. Marcus arrived with 2 attorneys. Natalie sat in the gallery, 3 rows back. Dark blue dress, pearl earrings, hands folded, the image of a worried daughter-in-law. She had chosen the seat carefully, close enough to be noticed, far enough to seem uninvolved. They had organized character witnesses, professional declarations, a psychologist's preliminary assessment based entirely on second-hand accounts. It was thorough, expensive, and built entirely on the assumption that I would arrive confused and undefended. I arrived with Gerald, and Gerald arrived with 31 years of meticulous documentation. The judge was a woman named Honorable Patricia Reeves, 60 years old. No patience for theater. She had seen this before, more times than she should have had to. A family member filing conservatorship while simultaneously holding financial interest in the subject's estate. She noticed the timing before Marcus's attorney finished his opening. "Counsel," she said, interrupting quietly, "your client filed this application in February." "That's correct, Your Honor." "And he submitted a financial restructuring proposal to his father in October." A pause. "Of the same year." Marcus's attorney adjusted his posture. "The 2 matters are unrelated, Your Honor." Judge Reeves looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "We'll see," and turned to Gerald. "Mr. Marsh, you may proceed." What followed was not dramatic. It was methodical. Gerald presented 30 years of consistent, documented financial decision-making on my part. Property records, trust instruments, legal filings, tax returns, investment decisions with detailed written rationale going back to 1993. All current, all coherent, all completely inconsistent with the portrait Marcus had tried to paint. Then Gerald presented the timeline. Marcus's consolidation proposal, October 14th. First conservatorship consultation with his attorneys, November 3rd. Filing date, February 7th. 3 weeks after I formally declined to sign. Gerald placed the timeline on the evidence table. The courtroom was very quiet. Judge Reeves studied it without expression. Then she looked at Marcus directly. "Mr. Harlan." Marcus straightened. "Your father declined your restructuring proposal in late January." "Yes." "And 3 weeks later, you filed to have him declared financially incapacitated." His attorney stood immediately. "Objection. Mischaracterization." The judge raised one hand without looking at him. Her eyes stayed on Marcus. "Is that timeline accurate?" A long silence. "Yes," Marcus said quietly. Judge Reeves set the papers down. She removed her glasses, and she said something I will never forget. "Mr. Harlan, this court has reviewed 31 years of your father's financial records. What I see is not a man in cognitive decline." She paused. "What I see is a man whose son filed legal action against him 22 days after he said no." Another pause. Longer this time. Application denied. The room exhaled. Natalie, 3 rows back, did not move, but her hands unfolded in her lap. and she looked at the floor. Marcus looked at me once as we left the courtroom. Just once. His face was not angry. It was something worse. Embarrassed. Like a man who had been caught not just failing, but failing at something he thought was already decided. I did not hold his gaze. I did not need to. Outside, the March air was cold. Gerald buttoned his coat slowly. "That's one chapter," he said quietly. "I know," I said. We walked to the car. Neither of us said anything else. Some victories do not need words. The consequences came slowly, the way real consequences always do. Marcus's professional reputation in the real estate circles we shared took a quiet hit. Word travels in those communities. Not loudly, not publicly, but when people know you filed for conservatorship against your father 22 days after he declined to sign over his assets, they remember. Doors close politely. Invitations stop arriving. Opportunities mention they went another direction. Natalie's interior design firm lost a significant referral source, one I had quietly provided for years without ever mentioning it. They never knew where those clients came from. They noticed when they stopped. Marcus's own investment group hit complications. A property partnership he had been building fell through when the senior partner declined to move forward. That senior partner was a longtime tenant of mine. He did not need to be told anything. He simply asked a few questions, heard a few answers, and made his own decision. I never asked him to. Some consequences arranged themselves. 6 months after the hearing, Marcus called. I let it ring 3 times, then answered. His voice was careful. "Dad." "Marcus." Silence. The kind that carries everything unsaid. "I think we should talk." "All right," I said. He spoke for several minutes. About grief. About fear. About feeling shut out after Eleanor died. About watching me carry everything alone and not knowing how to help. Some of it may even have been true. People are complicated. Betrayal rarely comes from people who are entirely wrong. It comes from people who are afraid, and who choose the wrong tools for that fear. When he finished, I said, "I know you were afraid, Marcus." He exhaled slowly. "I was. But fear doesn't give you ownership of what I built." Pause. "It never did." He said nothing. "Your mother and I built this for you. Not to hand it over before I was gone, but to leave you something real when the time came." Another pause. "You almost destroyed both." The line was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I know, Dad." Just that. 2 words. No defense. No reversal. Just 2 words that cost him something to say. That was the first honest moment between us in years. We did not reconcile that day. Reconciliation is not a phone call. It is time, and honesty, and proof, not promises. Marcus had work to do that I could not do for him, but I left the door open, because Eleanor would have wanted that. She always believed people could surprise you. She was usually right, even when it took longer than anyone expected. The last piece came quietly. 8 months after the hearing, Gerald completed the final trust restructuring. The Eleanor Harlan Foundation was fully operational. 6 properties transferred into permanent charitable trust, dedicated to affordable family housing in the city where Eleanor grew up. She had talked about it for years. We had planned to start it together. I started it alone, but it carried her name, and that felt right. More right than anything else that had happened since she left. At the foundation's first board meeting, I sat at a small table in a modest office on the 4th floor of one of my older buildings. 5 board members, a director, a mission statement Eleanor would have argued was too modest. Gerald sat beside me. At the end of the meeting, the director asked if I wanted to say anything. I thought about Marcus, about Natalie, about the consolidation proposal and the courtroom and the handshake at the retirement dinner. Then I thought about Eleanor, about the roses, about 17 months, about the way she held my hand on the last morning and looked at me without saying anything, because some things do not need words either. I looked at the board members around that small table and said simply, "Build something that lasts." People sometimes ask me if I regret how it ended with Marcus. Not the legal outcome, the relationship. I tell them the truth. I regret that it happened. I do not regret that I was prepared, because love and preparation are not opposites. Sometimes loving someone means protecting what you built from what they might do in a moment of fear and greed. Sometimes the most honest thing you can offer a person is consequences, not cruelty. Consequences. The difference matters more than people realize. There is one moment I return to most. Not the courtroom, not the phone call, the retirement dinner, the handshake. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone in the restaurant parking lot. The lights inside were still on. Marcus and Natalie still at the table. Already talking, already planning. I watched them through the glass for a moment. Two people building something on land they did not own yet. I was not angry, just quiet. The way a man gets quiet when he understands that the next chapter will require more from him than warmth, more than patience, more than love. It will require him to become exactly what they never expected. They thought my silence was surrender. They thought my grief had made me manageable. They thought an old man who had already lost the most important thing in his life had nothing left worth protecting. And for a while, I let them think exactly that. Because the most powerful position in any conflict is the one your opponent never considers a threat. I gave them the image they needed. The tired father, the grieving widower, the man who nods slowly and says Gerald will review it. And quietly behind that image, I gave them nothing else. They thought they had already won, right until the day they lost everything. And even then, I did not celebrate. I just walked back to the garden, looked at Eleanor's roses, and planted something new.